In the spring of 1987, a county drainage engineer named Carl Voss stood on the shoulder of a gravel road in Renville County, Minnesota, looked down at a man stringing wire along the lip of a roadside ditch, and told him he was fencing a swamp. He said it kindly. He had a clipboard under his arm and a measuring wheel leaning against his truck, and he said the words, the way a doctor names a harmless thing, so you will stop worrying about it. That ditch is a nuisance easement, he said. You cannot farm it. You cannot drain it without a permit. And you surely cannot fence it. It is wet ground that grows nothing but cattails and mosquitoes. The man on his knees in the mud was named Ott Dahl. He was 61 years old. He did not look up from the wire. He said only that he was not trying to farm it, and he went on tying the strand to the post. Carl Voss wrote something on his clipboard and drove away believing he had done a courtesy. 11 years later, in the fall of 1998, a buyer from a wholesale florist supply company in Minneapolis wrote Ott Dahl a single check against a single season's harvest pulled by hand from that same ditch. And the 3 more like it he had fenced since, for a sum that made the man's accountant ask him to repeat it twice. The number was $41,000. From a ditch. I want to tell you how a strip of wet ground that an engineer called worthless became the most profitable acre Ott Dahl ever worked, and why the thing that finally proved him right was not the money, but a count taken in a drought, with his neighbors watching, of how many cattails a single fenced ditch could grow when nothing else in the county would grow at all. Stay with me, because the part that matters is not the check. The part that matters is the water. To understand the ditch, you have to understand the man. And to understand the man, you have to understand that Ott Dahl was known for 2 things in Renville County. The first was that he almost never spoke first. The second was that he could read water, the way other men read weather, and he had been doing it since he was a boy, walking the low places of his father's land with a willow stick and a notebook. His farm sat in the flat black soil country west of the Minnesota River, 420 acres of corn and soybeans that he worked away. Everyone around him worked it, with a tractor and a planter and a chemical program the cooperative agronomist laid out for him every March. By the standards of 1987, he was an ordinary farmer having an ordinary hard time. Grain prices were low. His note at the bank ran to the middle of every winter. He was not a man anyone in town would have pointed to as clever. He drove a 1971 Ford tractor with a cracked seat, and his fences were the kind a man mends rather than replaces. And when the drainage engineer called his ditch a swamp, Ott Dahl had exactly one reason to disagree, and it was a reason he did not bother to explain to a man holding a measuring wheel. The reason was sitting in a cardboard box in his machine shed, and it had belonged to his grandmother. Let me tell you about the box, because everything that happened later came out of it. Ott Dahl's grandmother was named Inge, and she had come to Minnesota from the marsh country of Friesland on the northern coast of the Netherlands in 1901, and she had brought with her a way of seeing low, wet ground that nobody in Renville County shared, where the Americans around her saw mosquito land to be tiled and drained and turned into one more flat field. Inge saw a crop that simply was not corn. She had grown up in a place where people did not fight the water. They harvested it. They cut reeds and rushes, and the tall brown-headed plant the Dutch called lisdod, and the Americans called cattail, and they bundled it and dried it and sold it for thatch, for chair seats, for stuffings, for insulation, for a dozen uses that a wet country found for a plant a dry country called a weed. Inge had kept a journal, a thick canvas-covered ledger written in a careful slanting hand, half in Dutch and half in English, and in it she had recorded 40 years of watching one particular slough on the back of the family land. She wrote down when the cattails greened and when they browned. She wrote down which years the water stood high and which years it fell and how the stand answered. She wrote down that a cattail is not one plant but a colony, joined underground by a thick white running root she called the riverbank walker, and that this root is a pantry, and that the plant feeds itself out of last year's growth so completely that it does not care what the weather does, the way corn cares. Ott had read that ledger as a boy and understood almost none of it, and then he had carried it out to the machine shed when his grandmother died, and there it had sat for 30 years, while he farmed corn like everyone else, and watched the price of corn do to his neighbors what it was doing to him. What changed was not the ledger. What changed was a man named Lonnie Pruitt and a road. Lonnie Pruitt farmed the half-section directly east of Ott, and he was the kind of neighbor a story like this needs, because Lonnie was not a fool and was not a villain and did everything the experts told him to do. In 1986, the cooperative and the bank and the equipment dealer all told the same story to every farmer in the county, and the story was that the way out of low prices was to get bigger. Plant more, buy more, tile every wet acre so the planter never had to lift, and finance the tile and the bigger planter and the bigger combine against the value of the land, and grow your way out of the trouble by sheer volume. Lonnie believed it because the men who told it to him believed it, and they were not lying. They were simply confident in a model that had never failed in front of them. Lonnie took out a note that winter for $190,000. He bought a new 16-row planter and a self-propelled sprayer, the color of a fire engine. And he hired a contractor to bury perforated drain tile under every wet spot on his half-section, including the long wet ditch that ran along the county road between his ground and Ott's. And here the road matters, because the ditch was not Lonnie's and was not Ott's. It was a public drainage easement, a nuisance strip the county owned and nobody wanted, 60 feet wide and most of a mile long, running brown and reedy along the gravel, and when Lonnie tiled his field, he ran an outlet pipe straight into it, the way every farmer in the county used those ditches, as a place to send the water they did not want. That was the spring Carl Voss came out with his clipboard. The county was surveying its easements, because 3 of them had washed out culverts the year before, and Voss was the engineer assigned to walk them and write them up. He found Ott Dahl on his knees in the easement with a spool of smooth wire and a sack of steel posts, fencing the thing off from the road and from the cattle that did not exist. And Voss did the natural thing. He explained the ground to the man who had farmed beside it for 40 years. "You cannot farm it," he said. "It grows nothing but cattails." He meant it as a kindness. Let me tell you what Ott Dahl knew that Carl Voss did not, because this is the mechanism, and the whole story turns on it. Voss looked at the ditch and saw a failure, a place where the productive flat land gave out and turned to useless wet. Ott looked at the same ditch and saw the one place in the entire county that was about to get everything it needed. Because of the tile, all across Renville County that decade, farmers were doing what Lonnie did, burying tile to pull water off their fields fast. And all that water had to go somewhere, and where it went was the public ditches. The easements were becoming, without anyone deciding it, the richest, wettest, most fertilizer. Loaded strips of ground in the region fed a steady drink of nitrogen-heavy field runoff that would have burned a corn plant, but was a feast for a marsh plant built to gorge. Ott had read it in Ing's ledger, and then he had watched it with his own eyes for 3 summers. The cattails in that roadside ditch were growing taller and thicker every year. 8 feet, 9 feet. A dense brown-headed stand so heavy a man could lose a dog in it, and every neighbor who drove past saw a weed problem, And Ott saw a hayfield that harvested sun and wastewater, and asked nothing of him but the cutting. He fenced it that spring of 1987 for the plainest reason in the world. He had decided to harvest it, and a man does not harvest a thing he has not first claimed and protected. He went to the county, and he did the one thing none of his neighbors thought to do with a nuisance easement. He asked to lease it. The county clerk had no form for it. Nobody had ever asked. She had to go into the back room and find the statute that covered vegetation management on a public easement, and she read it twice, and then she made up a form on the spot by crossing out the words on a fence permit application and writing new ones in the margin. They charged him $12 a year and wrote him a permit to maintain the vegetation, and Carl Voss, who happened to be in the office that afternoon, and who countersigned it as the engineer of record, did so with the indulgent half-smile of a man humoring a hobby. He told the clerk, after Ott had gone, that some men needed a project to keep them busy, and that there was no harm in it, and that the county might as well take the $12. A hobby. That was the word Voss used in the county office that afternoon, and it was not the last time someone would use it. What neither of them understood was that Ott had not leased the right to maintain the vegetation. He had leased the right to own the harvest, and there is a great difference between the two, and the difference was worth, over the next 11 years, a great deal more than $12. I will come back to the leasing, because it turns out to be the cleverest thing in this whole account. But first, you should know what Ott actually did with all that brown grass, because pulling cattails by the ton out of a public ditch is not obvious, and it is not easy. And the way he learned to do it came straight out of the canvas ledger. Inge had written that the cattail gives 3 crops, not 1, and that a person who knows the plant takes a different part of it in a different season. In high summer, she cut the long green leaves and dried them flat, and these were the weaving stock, the material for chair seats and woven mats, and a chair caner in the old country would pay well for a clean dried leaf with no brown spot on it. The trick of it, she wrote, was the drying. A leaf dried too fast in the sun went brittle and cracked when you wove it. A leaf dried slow in the shade turned every day so it cured evenly, came out supple and strong and the color of pale straw, and that leaf was worth 3 of the brittle kind. In the fall she took the brown seed heads before they burst, and these were the stuffing crop, the down inside them lighter and warmer than the milkweed the pillow makers used. And the timing on this was a matter of a single week, because a head taken too early had not filled, and a head taken too late split open and scattered its down on the wind. In an afternoon, and in the deep of winter, when the stand was dead on top and the ground was frozen hard enough to walk a sled across, she dug the white running roots, the riverbank walker, and these were food and starch, and the thing that let a marsh family eat in a year. The corn failed. She had written down how a person ground the root and washed the starch out of it in cold water, and how the washed starch dried to a flour, and that a family that knew this never went hungry in a wet country no matter what the dry land crops did. Ott did not need the roots for food, but he had read every line, and he understood that a plant which stored that much energy underground was a plant you could cut hard above the ground, without killing year after year, the way you can mow alfalfa, because the crown lives below the blade. The cattail did not merely survive cutting, it answered cutting. Cut the stand in summer, and it threw up a thicker stand the next year. Because you had taken the top and left the pantry, and the root, sensing the loss of its leaves, spent some of its stored energy, sending up more shoots than it had sent the year before. The way a hedge thickens where it is trimmed. A man who understood, that did not harvest a cattail stand. He managed it, and the managing made it richer. Let me tell you what happened next, because this is where the patient thing began to compound while the loud thing began to climb. For 3 years, from 1987 to 1990, Otdahl harvested that one ditch mostly by hand and mostly alone. He built a low wooden sled with runners that would slide over wet ground and frozen ground alike, and a long curved knife he ground out of an old grass scythe. And in July he cut and dried leaf in the shade of the machine, shed exactly as the plant. Ledger told him, turning it every day, and in October he gathered seed head in the one good week, and he sold what he cut to a short list of strange small buyers. He found the way a quiet man finds anything, by writing letters and waiting. A basket maker in St. Paul who answered his first letter and asked for a sample bundle. A theatrical supply house that's the stuffed stage furniture and cushions and wanted the seed down by the sack. A man named Hollis who restored antique chairs out of a shop in Red Wing and needed real rush for the seats because the plastic kind looked wrong. A collector's eye, and a collector would pay for the difference. None of them bought much. They bought a bundle here and a sack there, and they paid slow. And the first year Ott cleared a little under $900 off the ditch after he counted the postage and the gas to deliver it. His wife Marta, who was a sensible woman and kept the household books in a spiral notebook on the kitchen counter, said out loud what the whole county was thinking. She said that $900 was a great deal of cold, wet work for very little money, and that a man his age had no business spending. July to his waist, in ditch water cutting weeds with a homemade knife, and that the corn ground was where the living was, and always had been. She said it across the supper table without heat. The way a wife says, a thing she has decided is true, and Ott ate his supper and did not argue, because she was not wrong about the year. She was wrong about the direction, and the direction was the whole point. Because while Ott cleared $900 off a ditch, Lonnie Pruitt was discovering what his $190,000 note actually cost. The new planter was magnificent. The sprayer was magnificent. The tile worked exactly as promised and pulled his fields dry a week earlier than his neighbors. And none of it mattered because the price of corn in the fall of 1987 was $1.80 a bushel, and $1.80 did it. Not $190,000 of debt, no matter how many rows you planted or how fast your ground drained. Lonnie had done everything right according to the model, and the model had a flaw nobody named out loud, which was that it assumed the thing you could not control, the price, would behave. Here I will turn to you for just a moment, because most of you have watched some version of this happen in your own county to a good man who took the advice everyone gave and found out the advice came with a risk nobody put on the brochure. You know how it goes. Let me get back to Ott, because in 1990 something arrived that has changed it from a hobby into a business, and it came in the form of a returning grandson. His name was Pete. He was 24. He had a degree in agricultural economics from the university in St. Paul, and he came home that summer because his mother had asked him to saw some sense into his grandfather. The family was worried. The old man was spending July up to his knees in a county ditch cutting weeds with a knife, while 400 acres of good corn ground needed him, and Pete arrived genuinely believing his job was to gently retire the cattail nonsense and get Grandpa focused on the real operation. Pete was not a snob, and he loved the old man, but he had spreadsheets in his head. And on his second day home, he sat at the kitchen table and laid it out the way the university had taught him. Grandpa, he said, I ran the numbers. The ditch nets you maybe $1,000 on 140 hours of labor. That is $7 an hour. The corn ground nets more than that per acre with a fraction of the labor. This is sentiment, he said, not a business. It is folk wisdom. And there was the word again, dressed in a younger voice and a kinder face. But the same word the engineer had carried in his clipboard, folk wisdom. Ott did not argue. He had never in his life won an argument by talking, and he did not intend to start. He said one thing. He said, "You are counting this year." Then he asked Pete to do something instead of arguing, and the asking was the beginning of the conversion. He asked Pete to help him for one full season and to keep the books while he did it, real books, every hour and every dollar, and to write down at the bottom of each month, not just what the ditch made, but what the ditch cost to make it, which was almost nothing. No seed, no fertilizer, no fuel beyond the sled, no chemical, no tile, no note at the bank. Pete agreed because he thought the books would prove his point. He was a fair-minded young man, and he kept honest books. And the honest books were the problem, because by August Pete had noticed something his spreadsheet had not predicted. The ditch had no input costs at all. Every dollar the corn made arrived with 80 cents of cost stapled to it, seed and chemical and fuel, and the interest on the iron. Every dollar the ditch made arrived nearly clean, because the field runoff fertilized it for free, and the rain watered it for free, and the only cost was the cutting. Pete had been measuring the ditch by its revenue and calling it small. When he started measuring it by its margin, he went quiet, and his grandfather watched him go quiet and said nothing, because a quiet that arrives on its own is worth 10 arguments. That fall, Pete did not go back to the city. He stayed, and he did the thing a young economist does when he finally believes a thing, which is he tried to make it bigger correctly. He was the one who realized there were not one but 4 nuisance easements within 3 miles that the county would lease for $12 apiece, all of them tiled into and fattening, all of them growing the same heavy stand, and all of them claimed by nobody, because every farmer in the county had been taught to see them as Carl. Voss saw them. By the spring of 1992, Ott Dahl held leases on 4 ditches, and most of a mile of cattail each, and Pete had found the buyers his grandfather's letters never reached. The wholesale florist trade, where dried cattail heads and long curls of dried leaf and bleached stalks sold by the bundle into the dried arrangement market at prices that had nothing to do with chair seats and everything to do with fashion. The county still called it a ditch. Pete had started calling it the wet acres, and he kept the books. And the books got better every year, while the books on every conventional farm around them got worse. Then came the summer that settled the argument. And it settled it the way these things are always settled. Not by anyone winning a debate, but by the weather doing what no one could argue with. The summer of 1988 had been dry, and people had forgotten it, the way people forget a dry year when the wet years come back. But 1998 was not dry. The summer of 1998 was the worst drought Renville County had seen in living memory, a sky-wide rainless heat that began in May and did not break until September. And it did to the corn country exactly what drought does. The fields that had been tiled to pull water off them now had no water to pull and no rain to replace it, and the corn curled and fired and tasseled short. And the county average yield that fell to 51 bushels an acre, where a normal year ran 160. Lonnie Pruitt, whose debt had been refinanced twice and whose land had been pledged against it, watched his $190,000 of efficient drained productive ground make a crop that did not cover the chemical bill. He was not careless. He had been told for 15 years that bigger and drier and faster was safer, and the drought did not care what he had been told. The same sun that fired Lonnie's corn did something else to Ott Dahl's ditches, And this is the mechanism paying off, so follow it. A cattail does not drink from the sky. It drinks from the water table, from the standing water in the buffer ditch that is fed by every tile line for a mile in either direction. And in a drought, the field tile still ran, because tile runs on the water that is already in the ground, draining the deep soil moisture that the corn could not reach fast enough to save itself. The drought that starved the corn fed the ditch. While the county's fields burned, the cattail stands along the easements grew the heaviest crop they had ever grown. 9 and 10 feet tall, the brown heads as thick as a man's forearm, because the plant built for wet ground, and was the one plant in the county, getting both water and a concentrated dose of the fertilizer the dying fields could no longer use. Carl Voss was still the county drainage engineer in 1998. He had been promoted, and he was 62 now, and close to retiring. And that August, the county sent him out one more time to walk the easements, because in a drought, the county worries about its ditches catching fire. He drove the gravel road he had driven 11 years before, and he found the same ditch, and it stopped him in the road, where every field around it was the color of a paper bag. The easement was a wall of green and brown 9 feet high, the densest, healthiest stand of any plant he had seen all summer. Fenced, leased, and being cut and sledded out in bundles by an old man and a young one, working a system that plainly was not a hobby. Voss got out of his truck. He was a sincere man and an honest one, and he had spent his whole career certain that wet ground was a problem to be solved, and he stood at the fence looking at the one piece of ground in the county that the worst drought in memory had made richer. And he said the only thing such a man can say, which was a question. How, he asked, how is this the only thing still growing? That was the autumn the buyer came out from Minneapolis to settle the season's account in person, because the volume had gotten large enough that the florist supply company wanted to see where the product came from before they signed another year. His name was Sorensen, and he was a senior buyer who had spent 30 years in the dried and preserved trade, and was not a man who said warm things. Pete had the season's harvest weighed and graded and stacked in the machine shed, dried leaf in one row, tied in even bundles, seed heads in another, sorted by size, the long bleached stalks in a third, and Sorensen walked the rows slowly, with his hands behind his back, the way a man walks who is deciding something and does not want his face red while he decides it. He stopped at the leaf and rubbed a blade between his thumb and finger to test how it had cured. He stopped at the heads and pressed one to feel whether it had filled. He picked up a single dried seed head and turned it in the light from the shed door and held it a long moment, longer than a man holds a thing he is only looking at. And Pete had learned by then not to fill a silence, so he waited. Sorensen asked one question. He asked where else in the upper Midwest he could buy this grade and this volume. And he asked it flatly, the way a man asks a question he already suspects the answer to. Pete told him the truth, which was nowhere, because nobody else in the state had thought to fence a ditch, and nobody else had a ledger that told them how to cut it. Sorensen set the head down, square the way he had picked it up. He did not negotiate. He did not ask what they wanted for it, or offer half of that the way a buyer does when a price is a thing to be haggled. He had already decided what the season was worth, and he took out a checkbook at the kitchen table while Marta poured coffee. And the loyal old farm dog, a black and white thing named Skip, who had followed Ott down every ditch for 9 years and slept across the shed door. Every night the leaf was drying lay across the kitchen doorway in the last warm patch of afternoon sun. Sorensen uncapped his pen, wrote without pausing, tore the check along the perforation, and turned it face up on the table and slid it across the oilcloth. And the kitchen went quiet. $4,000 from a ditch. The number landed on that kitchen table with a weight that had nothing to do with its size, because it was not a large number by the standard of a 400-acre farm, and it did not need to be. It was the verdict. It was 11 years of a man being told he was farming a swamp, answered in a single line of a stranger's handwriting, and the disproportion of it, that a strip of nuisance ground a public engineer had called worthless, had out-earned per acre every acre of corn the drought had killed around it, was the whole point. And everyone at the table felt it at once. Marta put her hand flat on the table. Pete looked at the check, and then looked at his grandfather. And his grandfather was not looking at the check at all. Ott was looking out the window at the ditch, the way he had looked at it for 40 years, and he reached down without a word and put his hand on the old dog's head, and that was all. He did not say, "I told you so." He had never once said it, not to the engineer, and not to his grandson, and not to his wife. And he did not say it now. He let the number sit on the table and speak for itself, and it did. Word of the check moved through the county, the way money news always moves, faster than the truth and louder. And by the next spring, the thing that had made Otdal strange began to make him useful. The first neighbor to come asking was a man named Buck, whose own corn ground had not paid its note in 2 years, and he did not come to mock. He came on a Sunday with his hat in his hand, and stood in Ott's machine shed, turning a dried cattail head, over and over the way Sorensen had, and he asked, plainly, how a man went about leasing a ditch from the county, and how a man learned to cut it without ruining it. Ott told him. He walked Buck out to the nearest easement and showed him the curved knife and the sled, and where to cut so the crown lived, and he gave him 3 pages copied out of the ledger in Pete's hand, and he told him which week to take the heads. He told all of them, because he was not a man who hoarded a thing once it was proven, and there was more ditch in the county than 4 men could ever cut. Over the next 3 years, the easements of western Renville County, which had grown nothing but mosquitoes since the first tile was laid, became a patchwork of small leased harvests worked by a dozen families who had stopped trying to grow their way out of trouble and started gathering what the trouble produced. The county clerk, who had made up one form by crossing out the words on another, now had a drawer full of them. Ott did not get bigger. That was the part that surprised the young economist most, and it was the part Pete came to understand last and best. Ott held his 4 ditches and refused a florist company's offer to finance a 5th county's worth of leases. And when Pete asked him why, the old man said the only thing in this whole account that came close to a speech, and it was 2 sentences. He said, "A ditch will feed you, as long as you cut only what it grows. The minute you ask it to grow what you need, it is corn again." Lonnie Pruitt did not lose his farm. And this matters, because the people who follow conventional advice into a structural trap deserve better than to be a cautionary punchline. Pete sat with Lonnie one winter and showed him the books on the wet acres. And Lonnie, who had a low ditch of his own, running the south edge of his half-section, fenced it the next spring and leased it and learned to cut it. And the income off that one strip was what carried his note through the 2 worst years until the prices came back. The man who had buried tile to banish the water made his survival, in the end, out of the one wet place he had not been able to drain. Carl Voss retired in the spring of 1999, and the story goes that at his retirement dinner, someone asked him what he had learned in 40 years of telling farmers where their water should go. And he said he had learned that he had spent a career being certain about the value of dry ground, and that the most profitable acre he ever surveyed was a ditch he had told a man not to fence. He said it without bitterness. He had been a good engineer and a sincere one, and the thing that corrects a sincere man is not humiliation, but evidence. And the evidence had been 9 feet tall and brown and standing in a drought. Inge's canvas ledger sits now in a glass case in the Renville County Historical Society, where Pete put it, because Pete stayed on the land and took over the wet acres and married, and had a daughter, and he decided the ledger belonged where the next person who wondered about a ditch might find it. He copied every page first. The copy stays in the machine shed where it always was. Let me tell you, the thing this whole account has been circling, because it is simple, and it is the reason the story is worth keeping. There are 2 ways of knowing a piece of ground. The first is the way of the model, and the map, and the measuring wheel. The way that asks what a thing yields per acre, and what it costs to make it yield, and whether the numbers close. And it is a good way, a true way, and it built the country, and it is not to be sneered at, but it can only measure what it already knows to look for. And it looked at a roadside ditch and saw a swamp, because a swamp was the only thing in its vocabulary. The second way is the way of the willow stick, and the canvas ledger, and the 40 years of watching. The way that does not ask what the ground should yield, but what it is already trying to give. And it is slower, and it does not scale, and it cannot be taught at a university in a single summer. And it is the only way anyone ever saw a hayfield in a ditch. The model measures what is easy to count. It counted the corn, and it could not count the cattails because it had filed them under weed. The drought did not read the file. What is rigid breaks, and what bends to the water keeps growing. Otdal worked his ditches another 9 years, and Skip is buried at the end of the longest one. Under a marker, Pete cut from a fence post, and on the warm evenings the old man used to walk the gravel road in the last of the light with the dog at his boot, past the green wall that the whole county had once driven by without seeing. And he never once called himself rich, because he never thought the check was the harvest. The cattails were the harvest. The check was just the county, at long last, learning to read the water.